Hey everybody, just here to tell you how to write the memo. So first, let's start out with a couple slides or a slide and a little bit more on how to write a memo in general. Provide the heading of the name of the company, usually a logo followed by the requisites of to, from, and the date. This is all on page 480 in Anderson Technical Communications. Provide a specific subject line that delineates an action. The action that you want to be taken or that has been taken. So the example is report of trip to computer dynamics seminar. State the purpose and main point of the memo up front. The purpose statement often is built around an infinitive verb. An example is the purpose of this memo is to blank, or I'm writing to blank. Consider including a short summary with background information. Possibly use informative headings such as summary, discussion, and recommendation. Often list action items. Bullets can often help here. Initialize the memo at the from line, meaning you physically write on the paper with your initials. Let's look at the general format before we go further. So in Anderson, we've got this. We can see again the logo sort of stamped up on the left-hand side. In this case, just the name of the company, no logo, but the name of the company, and the words interoffice memorandum. Most times, it's just simply listed as memo. It varies from workplace to workplace as to whether people include colons, but generally the to, from, and date are bolded. And generally, there is a tab that lines up these elements to the right. Notice the extra line space between the name of the company and the word memo and the to, from, date section. Another line space here, and then the subject, and then a line space where there's a brief introduction and headers. So here we can see the opening states the major finding, or if you will, summary line of the whole memo, and then a breakdown. You can see the next section will give background information. So this particular memo is a memo report. Recommendation, again, in this case, is a key section. So sometimes summary, sometimes discussion, but most often recommendation, meaning what will move forward. Since we're only doing one page of a memo, I'm only going to go that far. Let's go back to the project 3 memo format so you can get that. So for most of us, I think simply having a purpose statement, two purpose statements actually, one stating the purpose of the memo is to inform the class on how to write blank, right? Would be appropriate. But then also a purpose statement for what that particular document, type of document you're looking at, generally functions and generally does. So identify the purpose of the genre and the general primary, if not secondary, audience for that genre. Introduce the sample or samples, their audience. You can do that by footnote if you'd like, if your focus isn't really that much, or if you're not referencing the samples much in your analysis, you can do it by footnote. The second key section is structure and formatting. Generally, most students have followed this sequence. In structure and formatting, you want to consider how the document sections are arranged and why they might be sequenced in that way from beginning to end. So you'd go over the section of what's covered in the introduction if it's not self-explanatory. What's then following, often some kind of method section or some kind of results section. That would be an example of 3 sections that are prominent in an academic article. It's a good idea here to also articulate why they were sequenced that way in that pattern. Consider smaller features such as italics, underlining, or bold, line spacing, bullets, tables, graphs, and consider possibly why or why they were used or perhaps why they were not used. The third section, perhaps the more distinguishing section, is the communication strategies or rhetoric or logic section, sometimes named one of those three, depending on what emphasis you think you want to give that section. Again, this is in general. I'm saying students can come up with different subject headings, but in general, the memo will cover these areas one way or another. In this section, generally students have answered these questions, or at least one of them. What logics does the genre and sample follow? Does it use the introduction model used in an academic article? For example, the idea that there has to be a territory declared, a niche that's carved out, and that one claims that niche. Does it have a section that serves as a shop window? Does it use argument frames, for example, a problem solution frame, or short-term versus long-term gains or losses, or comparison and contrast in general? What makes the document persuasive or winsome to its given audience? How does it do that? Perhaps here consider whether your sample does that well. Perhaps consider whether the methods are complete, whether the data is clear and accurately shared, and where it's shared. Perhaps consider the conclusions drawn from the data, whether that's logical or not, and whether counter arguments are considered. These are all perhaps. Depending on your genre, they may not apply. An optional section 4 within the memo itself is to share some realizations gained from analyzing the specific samples and considering the office dynamics or the history of the document, if you will, the politics that might have been in play and how the sample was written. And the last option is a conclusion, maybe 1 or 2 sentences stating the overall key purpose and components one should keep in mind. Note the memo throughout should be having citations with footnotes to further elaboration on some concepts, but mostly citations just to list where you got your information. And very last but not least would be a word count. And we'll see that in the sample here in a second. Let's look at 2 samples quickly. So here we see memo to, from, and date from a former student. This is all fine, except I would add an extra line space here. Notice the tabs all line up nicely. The subject, genre analysis of policy briefs. Or we might write how to write a policy brief. Here we see an immediate statement of the purpose of the memo to the immediate audience, meaning me and your fellow students. The purpose of this audience is to establish how to write policy briefs. Fantastic. This sentence was a little generic, but still gets to the point. Policy briefs are produced by a variety of groups in hopes of influencing policies as they are made. In particular, this memo focuses on briefs addressing science policy. So that works perfectly. The next section is more so the purpose in general of the genre or the document as it's written for most audiences. The purpose of a policy brief is to describe an issue and potential policy solutions. By providing a concise look at the issue with evidence-based solutions, policymakers will have a clear idea of which policies must be enacted. So while basic, it's explicit, and that's the main thing that needs to be conveyed so that we all can learn from each other's reports. And you're fully defining the genre. Main objective of this genre or this kind of document or policy brief is to convey practical solutions to be taken. They also can be split in objective and advocacy briefs, which have secondary objectives. Maybe a slight footnote as to what those might be here. An objective brief provides an informative summary. Well, they do what I asked them to do exactly here, so my apology. An advocacy brief tries to persuade for a particular course of policy action. And we do see a footnote with some information on that. Here they went in quite extensively into audience, and generally I think this was appropriate given the genre and how they're trying to persuade those particular figures and who might read it. Given there's a variances to different kinds of audiences that read it, it's very critical to note that. So briefs tend to have to work across the spectrum, and I think the student did pretty well. They might have simply stated that often science needs to be ameliorated or tailored to an audience that does not generally understand base scientific concepts. The formatting is good. It considers, if you will, the sections in order, the summary, context analysis, recommendations, and consulted sources sections. Generally, these 5 sections are in presented one form or another. Here they go on to define each of the sections, and then they get into some specifics about graphics and how they're used. They might have simply mentioned a few more textual features, meaning whether italics or bullets are generally used or not, but otherwise really well done. And the last section that's required would be communication strategies, or that needs to be present in some form. As to how you do it, it's up to you. Here again, looking at how and why it needs to explain and clarify as well as persuade. So here are where we put in some extra tips and some rhetorical considerations to make it persuasive. Keep acronym usage to a minimum in this case. Secondly, define terms. Thirdly, expand on concrete actions. We see the listing of word count here. As to how to actually put in citations and footnotes, let's just go over that briefly. So wherever I'm at in a document, I think I have rights on this document. Go under insert, go down to footnote, and it immediately drops me into a footnote right here. And I would put in an APA citation as best I could, but generally what we need is the author's last name, first name, or organization, the date, and then the title of the work. Footnotes can also be used to expand on concepts and explain them or use other examples. Let's briefly go over a second one. Here we can use tabs again. The purpose of this memo is to analyze a genre of writing in the scientific field. Maybe we could be more brief. We could just say field guide. We don't necessarily have to state what will follow, but otherwise good. Purpose of a field guide is, why is it important? Not a bad follow. The audience, anyone interested in observing and identifying specimens. And again, a range of beginners to more advanced, so therefore it needs to cover both, which might be difficult. Perhaps we drop a footnote to further that point. Formatting. Content page is absolutely crucial, right? The foregrounding or ability to look at a table of contents and get to sections quickly. Some kind of reference guide. In this case, you would think there would be some keys that were a little bit more explanatory. Talking about graphical elements here as well. But the overall explanation of the document containing taxonomic groups followed by species was well done here. So we could have done some analysis as to the content of the actual concise and relative information of the subject. I'm not sure. I think they're describing the actual species beyond just common name and scientific name. Generally, there's a structure you can see across the description. So a bit more detail there would have been helpful. This was excellent down here, though. The two audiences that you have, readers and publishers, perhaps there are three, which are two different kinds of readers and publishers. So for reader efficiency, precise language must be specific and descriptive in details with information, only information that's necessary. And then this person did a beautiful riff on that. And the point is to be able to quickly reference the species. So locator key, here's where we go into those details I was looking for earlier. Locator key, color guides, reference picture, background information on specimens. Drawings can be better because we can see it in multiple angles. Also looking at the age of the species. And the consideration for publishers. A separate section here. So lots of great details. This particular person had a fantastic interview with a person that actually was an author of a guide. The word count afterward references is not part of the memo since they're already embedded within the citations. All right, guys, I think we're good enough right there. I hope you guys have a good one. We will catch you next class.